pretty funny.
I like the Shibuya.
Funny. I don't.
That's money, but even so, no apple, please. Alright, so British imperialism in India. We kind of talked a little bit about that on last week. We were talking about the effects of imperialism on Africa because there's a lot of parallels we can draw. For instance, the diversity we have there. I mean, India, you wouldn't think of looking at because it is relatively small insofar as continents go, or rather subcontinents are concerned. But the fact is geographically it's pretty broken up. So you've got a lot of different groups that develop their own cultures that more or less are unified based on the principles of religion, more so than a singular identity. So this meant that the British were able to exploit that to their own advantage. However, we have to understand that these theological instances also go into the cultural ones, deeper than even the British understood. And so that's going to cause some problems later on. I have some words for you real quick.
Yeah.
Two of these, Gurda and Sati, are not going to appear in the textbook. But basically, they both refer to Hindu traditions. And what we see happening is the British begin trying to more or less do what they do in other places and enforce their own cultural ideals and actually end up trying to spread Christianity, which generally annoys the locals and to rebelling. And so we have revolution. But there's more to it than that. For instance, one of the things we have to understand that's unique about India is the usage of Indians in the armies of the European powers there. So, for instance, both England and France had a vested interest in India back in the 1600s. So they used the East India Trading Companies supported by sepoys, which were Hindu soldiers that fought for the two European powers. So they would actually be trained in military-style drill, where military-style or European-style drill, wear European-style uniforms and fight with European weapons. And so they were more or less part or subsidiaries of the English or the French armies. Now, eventually the English are going to kick the French out, and India becomes almost totally a colony. Eventually it does become a colony as the English move to exert more or less direct control. But that's going to happen after what's known as the Sepoy Uprising. I think your textbook calls it the Sepoy Rebellion, but it means the same thing. Essentially what happened is in 1857, the Sepoys rebelled because the English were trying to force a lot of Hindus to become Christian. They did this with taxes and things like that. And they outlawed many of the practices that were sort of cultural for Hindus to do. Now, some of these, on the outside, you might be saying, well, yeah, they were kind of barbaric, because, looking at it, it might seem that way, and I guess you could make that value judgment. For instance, the Purdah was a tradition where if a Hindu woman lost her husband, when he was being burned at the funeral, she would leap onto the flames to die with her husband. So this was seen as kind of barbaric and outlawed. Other ones might not seem so bad. For instance, it was ritually significant for Hindus to bathe in the Ganges River. This was made outlawed. And the reason behind that, from the British standpoint, was think about it. The main water source where a lot of folks are getting their water is the Ganges, and people are taking a bath in it. So this could be problematic for public health. So they saw it as sort of a civic thing, not so much a religious one. In addition, they were trying to convert these Hindus, and in response, they flat out revolted. Now, this was a big problem for Britain because India, although it was a very important colony by this point, really didn't have the type of troops like England had. So the British soldiers were heavily outnumbered. So really, the first successes we see were not really that surprising. And the first Sepoys were really sticking to the English. It wasn't really until we have a change in how other people react, things kind of differently. For instance, there was a significant number of the Hindus that sided with the English against the Sepoys because they didn't trust the Muslims. The Muslims were, you know, they didn't want to go back to the Mughal dynasty, which was basically controlled by the Central Asian Mongol group. So they didn't really trust the Muslims, and so they sided with the English. Other Hindu princes had specific trade agreements that were very lucrative. They wanted to protect, and others did all this stuff. So ultimately, more Hindus side with the English than do with the Sepoys. The Sepoys are defeated. After that, the British step direct control up and make India a de facto colony, where it becomes the most significant, most powerful, most important colony of the British Empire. So it's going to be set up to be an industrial powerhouse. Of course, the exportation of cotton was the most significant production. Really? It's going to whisper stuff? I'm sitting there talking. Why would you do that? Anyways, so what happens is India becomes this majorly important colony, and a lot of money is spent to develop it. One thing we have to understand is building railroads is very expensive. There's a lot of materials that go into it, but most importantly, there's a lot of manpower that goes into it. I mean, you're talking about moving giant bits of, I mean, just the wood pieces, you know. Have you guys ever moved railroad timbers before?
Mm.
They weigh something like 80 to 90 pounds. Each one. So, you know, moving this stuff, driving the spikes, all this stuff, lots of labor, you know. And the thing that's nice about it is once you actually put railroad in, it becomes incredibly efficient. Even today, if you're shipping something, the most efficient way, other than by boat, is by railway, because of the physics involved in it. I mean, I'm talking something in the neighborhood, I forget the exactitudes of the comparison, but something like a quarter per gallon per pound or something like that. Or I don't remember the exact measurement, but basically in a nutshell, it's hugely efficient. And what's interesting is you know, railway actually makes the most sense for moving people and things around. The problem, the real problem with railways, beyond anything else you can complain about, is the fact that they are limited. Railways can only go where tracks are laid. So this means that, you know, for our intents and purposes in the States, where we're all spread out and everyone lives in separate things, that you need personal transportation as a style of life. Other places where you're kind of closer, you can walk to things like that, you can use railway, and it's more sensible. So railway is incredibly important for the development of an industrial powerhouse. So this meant that all these railways are being built. To this day, India has the third largest system of rails in the world. That's significant. So India is developed largely as an industrial power, but at the expense of a great deal of oppression. Now, to understand this, you guys know how Hinduism and Buddhism are related. You guys know what those faiths believe. Have you studied these other faiths?
I feel like we've gone over a little bit, like,
Okay, let's talk about it, because and first of all, understand this is a gross like generalization. You know, we're not going into huge details, but let's talk about what they believe. Okay, so first of all, the two main faiths that grow out of India are Buddhism and Hinduism, which both have similarities, although how you go about it is different. But at its core tenet, there's one belief, and that is life sucks. Essentially, life is hell, and that the goal for every human being, an animal for that matter, is to stop being reborn, because they believe in reincarnation, that basically as once you die, you are reincarnated into another body. Now what type of body that is depends on what you do in life, because the way you go about changing that, the way about you get out of this cycle of death and rebirth, well, this is where things kind of depend. Hindus organize themselves into classes or castes, jatis. Basically, you are born into a caste, and that determines which part of the society you're part of, which element of culture you will have, who you can marry, what job you're going to have, all that stuff. And you can't get out of that caste. Once you're born into it, you're going to die in it. And basically, each caste has a set of rules, more or less, a set of things they're supposed to do. That's called their dharma. And by doing their dharma, they accrue karma. And with enough karma, you can eventually be reborn into the next higher caste. And so your idea being, once you get to the highest caste, if you do enough good work, you can stop being reborn. And that's the interesting thing, is because on its outward sign, the idea sounds like oblivion, where you cease to exist, but it's not really expressly true. It's sort of like becoming one with everything. It's a better kind of interpretation. So that's Hinduism in a nutshell. Buddhism, again, varies from place to place, but basically the idea is that what causes pain, why life is hell, is because we want stuff. If we can do away with want, we can move beyond that. And the way you do that, well, depends on the vehicle of Buddhism you believe in. But by the way, Buddha, do you know what that word means? It means enlightened one. Someone who has achieved getting out of the cycle of death and rebirth. And actually, you can come back as sort of their version of a saint and help others achieve enlightenment. So there's actually more than one Buddha. Saying the Buddha is not really true. Generally speaking, in Buddhism, you're talking about the first Buddha, which is Siddhartha Gautama, but that's not the only one. So, again, how you get about that, well, that varies depending on from place to place. But why all this matters is in India, the Jatis was a sense of social stratification. There were social classes, and this meant that the British exploited this. They put themselves at the top of the social caste and saw themselves as better than every other Indian. Again, see social Darwinism. So the treatment of these Hindus caused a lot of animosity, some rebellions, and a desire to form a free and independent India. And eventually, this is going to happen, largely due to the work of Mohandas Gandhi. You guys have heard of Gandhi before?
Yeah.
What do you know about Gandhi? Anything? Kind of a groovy guy, maybe. If I say the word civil disobedience, does that strike a chord? Passive resistance. Basically, I'm not going to do what you tell me, but I'm not going to fight you either. You know, I'm not going to do these things that I disagree with, but I'm also not going to fight either. Now, here's the thing with it. On its outside, that sounds like, oh, how peaceful and how hippie, how cool. That's not really what it is. It's edgy. It's, I'm not going to do that. You know, and the reaction to this is pretty extraordinary. There are accounts of British soldiers riding their horses on top of the Hindus, the protesters, as they protested against it, of beating them, or things like that. And all of this, by the way, is being captured by photograph and being sent to newspapers around the world. The criticism of this builds to the point where eventually India is still allowed to be free. And civil disobedience is used as a model by the civil rights movement in the 1960s because Dr. Martin Luther King recognized that it was an effective means of fighting back without actually lowering yourself to what they saw as wrongful violence. You know, it was a way of peacefully resisting, but in a way that was effective. In fact, the way that Gandhi got involved with this is kind of an interesting story in of itself. Because Gandhi was actually born into the highest caste. He was very well educated. He was wealthy. He was a lawyer. He was actually schooled in England. So he was a very high member of society working in India. And one day, he was on a train, and he was told he had to give up his seat to a white person. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm of the highest class. I don't have to give up my seat. This person was like, yeah, you do. You're not white. And so he realized that the social inequality was beyond anything that had been set up by India, and so began fighting it, and actually indeed tried to overturn the idea of the Jati in general. Like, he was killed by another Hindu. You guys are aware of that. So, you know, again, this is not like civil disobedience in terms of everyone's hippie, everything's cool. This is civil disobedience. It's basically turning the mirror on the system and seeing if it can stand the sight of itself. And it's very effective. By the way, is that story of the train sound familiar at all? Rosa Parks, anybody?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, are you aware of the fact that she was not the first person to do that? The original person to refuse to give up her seat to a white person, I don't even know the name of it. Most people don't. The reason that we don't know is because she was had a child out of wedlock, and the NAACP thought that would be bad propaganda, so they got Rosa Parks to do it instead. What she did was no, random chance. It was set up specifically as a calculated act of civil disobedience for the purpose of, again, pointing the mirror at the system and try to have the unfair system overturned. So I just want to point out that civil disobedience isn't all about just being a hippie and being cool. It's rebellious. Its very nature. It's something that we would respond most likely very negatively to unless we were aware of things. That's what's kind of interesting about it. Anyways, so after India becomes a colony, there is a movement to attempt to free it, and one of the groups that's organized is the Congress Party. But ultimately, we see the same problem based on faith. The Muslims do not trust the Hindus and vice versa, so eventually, in 1906, the Muslims formed their own branch of the Congress Party, which eventually aims at creating its own country, which is why Pakistan exists. Because Pakistan is the area that is controlled mostly by Muslims, and the area south becomes India, which is Hindu. And to this day, there's fighting along the border, or very least a Cold War type aspect, where they're not necessarily direct fighting, but a lot of animosity in the borders contested, especially in the area of Kashmir. Who you ask who belongs to will basically vary from person to person what they say. Most maps actually have the border as a dash instead of a solid line, as we really don't know. It's kind of up in the air. But ultimately, the situation in India is going to be kind of the same story we see with a lot of these industrial powers that are being imperialized. In some cases, the effects are positive. Imperialism isn't all negative, which is actually somewhat of a controversial statement because, basically what you're saying is that enslaving of another people is okay. It isn't, but we will say that in some cases the technology does benefit India. I mean, India does emerge as a world economy because of imperialism. That being said, that doesn't make any bit of the treatment of the Hindus or anybody else in India correct. It's just an aspect of it. Also the treatment of diseases and things like that. I mean, there were benefits to imperialism. In fact, some Hindus, because of that, sided with the British in the separate place. Other versions are very negative. One thing, though, that's also interesting, I find, is that as much as Britain is trying to change the culture of India, they too are being influenced by Indian diet, Indian cuisine, Indian dress, things like that. For instance, the most popular drink, you think of this drink whenever you think of Britain. And tea. Where does it come from? India. In fact, it had never been experienced before contact with India, or very least Central Asia. So where does this come from? Well, partially, it has to do with a survival mechanism. Water is not trustworthy, yes? So what can we do to make water drinkable?
Boil it.
Which you have to do when you make tea, right?
But then you might as well go for, I had to put flavor in.
True. But here's the thing is that they didn't know that it was the boiling necessary at first that caused it to be better to drink. They just knew that it was safe to drink tea. It wasn't safe to drink the water. So it's just an interesting thing. That's also, by the way, why beer is better, because you have to boil the beer mash in order to make beer. So again, anything that you boil was safe. By the way, America, we don't drink tea. What do we drink? Coffee. Which you have to. There you go. It's the same sort of thing. In fact, Americans' love of coffee is partially tied to our hatred of Britain during the Revolution, because they were all about tea, so we're not going to do that, we're going to do coffee instead.
I like both.
To each your own.
I like Starbucks coffee, but I don't like
Coffee is disgusting.
It is definitely an acquired taste because it's bitter. In
I
fact,
put lots of sugar.
I find that a lot of people don't like tea either, not really.
Yeah.
I love tea. I like
And
Cold
that's
tea, hot
the,
tea,
the,
I
the,
love
the
real
caveat right there. Sweet tea. It is real tea. It's just there's a lot of sugar in it. You know, see, anything's okay with a lot of sugar.
I like unsweetened
Yeah,
tea, iced tea, hot tea.
To each their own. Taste be true.
I like anything.
But I will say this: there's a lot of things that are acquired tastes. That's kind of interesting because what's interesting is the human mouth. Is the more you have strong flavors, the more you get used to them, they become bland. So you need something with even stronger flavor to sort of like actually, you know, okay, there's something going on there. So you keep that up over time, and you get some pretty funky tastes and stuff that, you know, if you're just going straight into it, you're like, you know,
Like a lemon.
well, maybe, you know, I don't know. I mean,
I see lemons.
there's definitely like sour things like that, but I mean, it's like, there's a lot of spices and things like that that you need stronger taste to it. Otherwise, it's, you know, you lose the subtlety, if that makes any sense. Sort of like how, you know, like hot sauces and things like that. If you develop a taste for them, it's like you need like hotter to get that same kick. So it's just you develop a taste to it. And that's true for a lot of different flavors too. It's kind of interesting too because children, generally speaking, are thought to have more sensitivity to flavors. That's why if you think of like foods that kids hate, they're often very strong, like broccoli or kale or spinach or things like that. They're very bitter. You know what I mean? But as you grow older, your taste buds are literally feeding into the ground where you've had so many different sharp flavors that you don't even taste it. It's a true story. It's kind of weird how that works out. That being said, contrary to what your parents may say, there are some foods you will never like regardless. And it's mostly psychological. Like, you might actually like the taste of it, but you can't stand eating it. Because you learn not to like it as a kid. You know, onions are that way for me. I actually really like the taste of onions. I just don't like eating them.
I don't like the
It's
texture.
weird.
Like I like grapes, I don't like the texture.
It is funny how texture plays a role as well.
Bananas, like the texture.
Human mouth's an interesting thing.
It's just like a random
Anywho,
hole in your face.
your
Like
face.
the mouth is up here.
So these are set boys. And again, it's an interesting mix of the different elements and the different powers. For instance, the jacket is actually sort of a mix and cut between European and East Asian, just with the turnbacks and everything else. However, you look down, well, it looks like they're wearing like shorty shorts, and in truth, they're actually wearing trousers tied really tight with these cloth like wrappings that are called gaiters. And the reason behind that is as you're marching, you know, you've got things like weeds and cockleburrs and things like that you're going through. Instead of like ripping apart your pant leg and thus ripping your skin apart, it just attaches to the hard, often canvas or even leather material that makes it the gaiters, and so it protects your clothing. So it makes sense to have. In addition, you have the turban, which again for the climate in India, which is tropical, makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't want something that's going to keep too much heat in, but you also don't want nothing because you have the sun beating down on you, so it's a nice mix. It allows you to prevent the moisture, but also keep you nice and cool. And this shows the various railroads. One thing, were you guys aware there were different gauges of railroad track? Or in other words, that there were different distances between the wheels? You guys know, first of all, why do train wheels, why are they spaced the way they are? Because they were based off of wagons. Why did wagons have the spacing they do?
They keep balance, like
Because I'm talking the
to
exact
hold the
reason.
weight.
The reason is because they were the same width as Roman chariots. Because a lot of the roads had these ruts in them, and you want the wheels to stick in the rut on the outside because they'll break. Why are the chariots that width? Because it's the size of two horses' bones. Perfect width. Because they're all about. That's by the way, our cars are this width they are. Same width as the horse's body.
Oh wow.
Dude. And we record.